Yeah. Okay, I just sent you the link. Can you tweet it?
Yes.
And I'm thinking we'll just do the first hour and then shut it down.
That makes sense.
And just do your presentation.
Yeah. Who's getting who's
Starting this? I don't know. I'll find out.
okay.
I don't know why it didn't.
What's the matter?
It's not coming in. Oh, it you misspelled Gmail. Sorry.
Here, I can show you where it is.
Okay.
Is that to it? You resent it?
Yes.
So that means I.
There we go.
Yeah, sorry about that.
You were like, this is super, yeah. I don't know.
Okay, I want to do the song that I always like to do. It'll be better than the one I tried yesterday, I promise. So, for this to work, we're going to divide into parts eventually, okay? We're just going to sing songs everybody knows on top of each other. And it really works. So, the songs are, I want to sing, sing, sing. Like, I want to sing, sing, sing. Okay, that'll be one. The second one will be, When the Saints.
Oh, that's not right.
All right, I'm going to do that one. Sure, swing low. There's Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. And then for those who are really brave, we'll throw in This Train is Bound for Glory. All right? So we'll all sing together the first one, and then some brave group of people will continue to sing it. I need a song leader for I Want to Sing, Sing, Sing. We'll stand up here with me and keep singing that song. We'll do it in a minute. All right, tell you what, we'll sing all through, then you choose the one you like, all right? So here they go. Everybody stand up if you're able and are interested in standing up. Okay. So the first one goes like this. I want to sing, sing, sing. I want to shout, shout, shout. I want to sing, I want to shout. Praise the Lord. When those gates go open wide, I'll be sitting by Jesus' side. I want to sing, I want to shout. Praise the Lord. You got that one? And then the next one's easy. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming forth to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming forth to carry me home. Okay, we got that one. Next one is Oh When the Saints. Oh when the saints go marching in. Oh when the saints go marching in. Lord, I want to be in that number. When the saints go marching in. And for the truly brave of heart, the last one will be This Train. This train is bound for glory. This train. This train is bound for glory. This train. This train is bound glory. Oh, carrying up the righteous and up. This train is bound for glory. This train. Now, I need a song leader for each. Who wants to do I want to sing. Thank you, Kitty, for offering. Okay, come up here with me. Who wants to do Swing Low? Who's the song leader for Swing Low? Thank you, Roger. Oh, Peggy, you want to do Swing Low? Okay, Roger, you've got one of the sings. All right, and I'll do this trade. So we're going to sing everybody together, and then some will stick with Kitty, whoever feels moved to do so, and then we'll go on to Swing Low, and some will stick with Peggy, and then we'll add When the Saints with Roger, and then the last group will add in with this trade. Got it? I want to sing, sing, sing. I want to shout, shout, shout. I want to sing, I want to shout. Praise the Lord. When those cares go rolling wide, I'll be sitting by Jesus' side. I want to sing, I want to shout. Praise the Lord. Keep going. I want to sing, sweet chariot, coming forth to carry me home. Sweet road, sweet chariot, coming forward to carry me home. Keep going with Peggy. Sweet chariot, I want to sing, I want to shout, praise the Lord. When these gates are open, I want to sing, I want to shout, praise the Lord. Again. I want to sing. It's bound for this train is bound for this train is bound for glory. One more time. This train is bound for glory. Well done. So everybody, I don't remember when I met Jessica. I think I remember the first time I met Laura, which was at McCormick Seminary a long, long time ago. But over the years, they have both become good friends. And I count them as friends for a variety of reasons. One is that they keep me honest. And I need friends who keep me honest about hard conversations. And the conversations around race and racism and privilege, white privilege and power, those conversations are not easy to keep in front of us. They do it with graciousness and a great sense of humor, for which I am eternally grateful, because people who smile at me when they say hard things to me help me to come along. And so I count them among the most important people in helping me stay accountable. And I invite all of you this afternoon into a conversation with them that I expect will challenge me, because each time I work with them, and it's now been a number of times over a number of years, they are never settled in their own thinking, either one of them. I said to them yesterday when Kitty and I and Laura and Jessica were making plans for today, that one of the things I most appreciate is that I have kids and no time for pop culture, and they don't. And so they watch pop, they're always in touch with kind of what's going on in culture out there. They know the latest Jon Stewart video that I absolutely have to see. They've been watching things, and one of the things I've really appreciated about Paul's presentations actually is that he puts in front of me things that I know my kids are watching and I have no idea exists. So I'm really grateful for my friends who helped me to access that part of the world and bring me up to date on things. Another reason I really appreciate them is that they are both deeply critical of and incredibly loving for the broader church. And that's an important thing that has to happen, I think, right now. All of us have huge work to do, and the church as an institution, the Presbyterian Church USA, and the church as a much broader institution, institutional religion as a broad category, all of those institutions are struggling right now. And I think people who are willing to be both loving and critical at the same time are incredibly important to us. And they do that over and over again. They watch very closely what's taking place in the church, and they bring their analysis about power, how power works and how it should work, and race to that critical conversation about church, and they say hard things that I think the church desperately needs to hear. So for all those reasons, I am really grateful that they were both able to come. Jessica has come on a fairly regular basis to work with us on different things. We were really intentional this time about asking both of them to come, that we really wanted them to do this together because we think that, frankly, I think that their relationship is really cool. They are, in fact, married. You are married, right?
We are.
They are married to one another. I'll just let you all know that so you're not wondering for the next 7 hours if you don't know them. And there's something magical that I find happens when I'm with both of them together because they have really amazing energy that feeds off one another. So I'm grateful to both of you. Here's just a rough idea. We're going to spend about 45 minutes to an hour in teaching mode, where I know that many of you really love new ideas and theories that you can hang your hats on, and they bring those things to us, and so they're going to do some of that teaching work with us. And they're going to give some time for small group work to try and respond to the teaching. We'll create that moment. And I want to say that we'll do that in small groups at least some of the time. And there are some folks here from Stony Point Center, from the Community of Living Traditions. Actually, will you all raise your hands so people know who you are? That row, the holy row back there. Okay. So they will have their own small group with Kitty so that if there are things we want to work on together that come out of this, we're actually letting them do their work. And the Peace Fellowship folks will have small group meetings to kind of think about where the Peace Fellowship goes. And by the end of the afternoon, I hope to lead us into some conversations about what the implications of this work are for us organizationally. So it's not just how do I as an individual relate to these questions, but what does it mean for us as an organization? And then I hope that we'll do that in small group work and then maybe even come back. We had this kind of fun idea about creating kind of a gallery from the small groups, thinking about next steps where we could come back and look at some visual that we all create together about where we go from here as an organization. And we will wrap up promptly at 5 o'clock. No matter where we are, the order of the day is rest at 5 o'clock. Okay? Any questions? Laura and Jessica, we are so grateful that you're with us. Thank you for coming.
Good afternoon. Thanks so much for having us. We love hanging out with you guys, honestly. My first job out of college was at the Presbyterian UN office, which at that point was working with it was part of the Peacemaking program. So I feel like I've been very fortunate to be with Peacemaking folks for a long time. My name is Laura. I currently serve as the Vice President of Church and Public Relations at the Presbyterian Publishing Corporation. That means I go out and I talk to people and then I take whatever I learn back and we talk about it around the editorial and marketing tables so that we make sure we're always responsive to the needs of the church. And that also means I get to read a lot of cool books. So that's very fun. My racial background, because it's going to come up, so we might as well just get that out of the way. My father's family is white Jewish from Eastern Europe. They came, probably the earliest came in 1906. And my mother's family is Japanese American that came in the early 1900s. My great-grandmother was actually born in California. She was the first second-generation Japanese American girl to be born in her particular town. I think she was born 1910-ish. So I speak Spanish as my second language, obviously, because I'm from the West Coast and Japanese was not really an option, nor a need, as it turns out, except when it comes to food. And I identify as multiracial Asian American. Something that's particular to multiracial people is that, first of all, now it's okay to be multiracial. There have always been multiracial people in the US. It's just due to power relationships and other systemic dysfunctions, it was not always such a great thing for people, nor was it helpful to identify as multiracial. Also, even siblings within the same family that share the same racial makeup will not identify the same way. So just to be clear, that multiracial doesn't mean the same thing for every person. Get that out there. I'm also an ordained teaching elder in the PCUSA. I've never served a congregation I consider the church to be a congregation.
Hi, and I'm Jessica. As I said, I was born naturally amplified.
So I will hold the mic down here. I'm a 1.5 generation queer Latino Puerto Rican descent. So I was not born in the U.S. I was born in a colony of the U.S. called Puerto Rico. And we'll get to that a little bit in our conversation later on. And moved here when I was 15 years old and have now lived in the U.S. going on 2/3 of my life. In the next couple of years, I'll reach that milestone. And so what that has meant is this interesting experience of being both immigrant and citizen, having the privileges that come with a blue passport, while understanding that when I see the world and participate in the world, and when people see my name and experience me, they're not experiencing a person who is American per se. I think of myself as Latina and not Puerto Rican. Puerto Rican is my ethnicity. At this point, I have a race, and that race is Latino. And I live out of that race, and I think of the people in that box with me as people with whom I am in relationship with and who are my community. And in many ways, I am multiracial because what it means to be Puerto Rican is to be multiracial. We are a country of multiracial people. And then the last thing I'll say is that I must give a shout out to the organization I work with that allows me to be in this place. I'm a national organizer for an organization called Crossroads Anti-Racism Organizing and Training. And that's who I have been in relationship to and with for the last 15 years of doing this work, which I began when I was like 15. And so I'll let you wonder about that. But Laura's gonna get us started.
Yes. So we wanted to be really deliberate about connecting with the great work that Paul has already done with us. We thought after yesterday morning, like, Randy's already setting us up. It's great. It's very good. So we wanted to take a look at the list of spiritual cravings that he put out for us. So purpose and meaning, self-worth, belonging, they're on the handout, so you don't have to rewrite them down. Expression, explanation, inspiration. Oh yeah, if you don't have the handouts, they're on either side. And we thought, this is so interesting. We'd not thought about this. We're very Western educated, so we always think Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? We think that way. All those master's degrees did socialize us well. And we thought about how in the US, all of us have a racialized identity, whether or not we know it. We were talking a little bit with Paul about how Asian American is not a real thing. It's become what academics call reified. We talk about it so much that it becomes a real category. So that's what we mean by racialized identity, that normally I would identify as Japanese American, but within the US racial construct, the race group that I get stuck in is Asian American. And people who come as immigrants, that can be a very confusing process to come from a continent that has 34 plus countries, that you had this ethnic identity and then you're tossed into this racial identity. And so what happens oftentimes is we begin to, at some point, identify with other members of that racialized group. So usually when I'm out in the world, I think I'm an Asian American. That means I drink boba, bubble tea, which is Taiwanese originally, and I eat a lot of Chinese food, and probably my favorite cuisine is Korean food. But if I were in Asia, that would not be true. I would not necessarily have that Pan-Asian identity. And we talked about how all of these groups have racialized identities, and we usually tend to think that it is people of color that have racialized identities. So that white people don't. It turns out that you do. That's a thing too. And we all get purpose, meaning, self-worth, belonging out of these racialized identities. That because race dehumanizes, Paul talked a lot about language dehumanizing us, and race dehumanizes us because it takes us out of being our unique individual selves, out of our unique ethnic identities or our country-specific identities, and it sticks us into a box that we may or may not like very much. And then we, as people of color, tend to use these imposed identities as a positive thing. It's awesome to be Asian American. Hello. Noticed? right? So I gain a lot of purpose. I gain a sense of belonging to a group that's much larger than just multiracial Japanese Americans, although there's a lot of us. I get a lot of explanation for why my life is the way it is by identifying with this particular group. And it turns out that this happens for every group. We use it as a way to create meaning in an oppressive system. And it's invisible to white people, but it also helps create meaning for white people. What happens too is that we, once we're in these groups and we're identifying with these groups, we tend to police the boundaries. So there are jokes sometimes about the card, the Asian American card, or I will speak only for my group. And sometimes we'll tease someone and be like, yeah, I'm taking your card away, because you just acted not very Asian American, right? So that's actually not cool. You shouldn't do that. It's not okay. But what happens is that communities of color will police the boundaries. So for a lot of Asian Americans, I'm not Asian American enough because my parents were not immigrants post 1965. So that's one of the things that happens. We will listen to another piece, I believe, later that talks about how white people also police the boundaries of whiteness and what's acceptable. But I'll let a white man talk about that. It's more appropriate. And because we have to talk about the thing that is dehumanizing us, we're going to talk a lot about how racism is not just dehumanizing for people of color, it is also dehumanizing for white people. And that honestly, we should all be worried about it, not because we feel sorry for those poor brown people or how I've been oppressed, which maybe also should be, but to think about how we, no matter what our racial background, have been dehumanized. And in order to regain the humanity that God created for us and in us, we need to fight against racism. So I don't know if you've noticed, but the church isn't really good about racism or talking about it. As a minister, I can say that we're not very good about that. And so, Jessica, I believe,
yes,
talk to us about.
So you were right. Skip the mic, Jessica. We're doing just fine.
I'm telling you, you can hear me. No problem. I have no problem being. I have no problem being heard. You may not like what I have to say, but I pretty much can make you hear it. So part of the thing that I appreciate about this list behind me is that when it comes to having. I don't even want you to look at the list. By the way, the list, you have some quotes in your handout that contextualize this list from, and this comes from the work of a priest, a diocesan priest named Brian Massingill, who teaches ethics at Marquette University. And Brian Massingill wrote a book called Racial Justice in the Catholic Church. And he is reflecting in that book about why is it that in the church we have such a hard time talking about race? Why is it that we have 50 million committees and write 50 million reports and present them to General Assembly and put them in the website and then nothing changes? What is it about these conversations that's so difficult? And he identifies 4 things that I think are worth naming. One is that in the fallacy that I would call post-racial colorblind America, because we are neither post-racial nor colorblind, we have lost the linguistic capacity to actually talk about race. That if you think about how the language that we have to talk about race today is actually 1950s language. Jim Crow, segregation, right? We have this language that no longer reflects or isn't nuanced enough to deal with the complexity of race in America today. So he feels that the first challenge that we have as a religious community is that we have to reclaim language as a way of being able to see what is actually happening within our body. Not just see what's happening in the US, but actually see how we are participating in racism. The second thing he says is that we don't like being uncomfortable. We crave comfort. And this is a conversation that is profoundly uncomfortable. And so we might be able to get some language, but then we get into the conversation, and then the next thing that happens is I'm uncomfortable, Now I'm going to use the word and see if you've ever been in a conversation like this. Oh, I feel unsafe. So then what happens to the conversation? Done. Right? We're done. We are no longer talking because safety has been issue, and we've come to confuse safety with discomfort. Those aren't the same thing. My body isn't threatened if I am uncomfortable. I'm just uncomfortable. Might as well name that. The third thing that he says is that, okay, so maybe we can get some language. Maybe we can build our capacity for discomfort. Then we hit the third obstacle, which is we don't like or often have the ability to think systemically. We're such an individualistic nation. Everything is an individual problem. So I want to talk with Rick about systemic racism, and Rick wants to talk about our relationship. And quite frankly, I don't really want to talk about our relationship because that's not the problem. The problem is that we live in a society that is structured in such a way where power is operating in such a way that is creating something called racism that is destroying both of us. It has nothing to do with whether or not we have a good relationship. So we have to then figure out, how do we think systemically about this problem? So let's say that we get language, we figure out how to be uncomfortable, we get a little bit of a systems capacity and systems thinking inside of us, and then we actually hit the actual greatest obstacle for this conversation in the church, which is we have to deal with our complicity. We have to deal with the fact that it's not that our faith, in this case Christianity, got co-opted and misused, but we have to deal with the fact that we helped create the thing that is killing us. That we wrote the theology, that we wrote the papal bulls, that we wrote the ethics books and the biblical interpretations that made racism what it is and have it the hold that it has on us. That's the obstacle we have to overcome. How do we face our complicity? It's the actual question that we have to deal with it. Because if we don't, then our faith will never be able to wage peace. Because it's not in our DNA in its current form to be able to do that. It's too wrapped up in a history that does the opposite of that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Good, I'm glad that was clear. You. Back to Laura.
Just so you know, we did write down a little bibliography of references, all the things that we refer to, we tried to put down on the last page of the handout, so you don't have to overly stress.
Much of that first chapter of Messinger's book is free on Amazon.
Oh,
Well done. Thank you for that.
yeah, but if you were wanting to support an author.
You've done your institutional.
Good job, Laura. Good job, Laura.
I'm so right, it'll be fine. Okay. So we think it's helpful when we decide we're going to start talking about it and gaining language and gaining the capacity to sit in discomfort, all of us together, yay, that it helps to have a shared analytical framework. And because we're all distinct humans with our own expertise, within our own experiences of race and racism in the US, it can help to come up with a few things that we at least know, okay, if we're gonna have this conversation, it's gonna vaguely be along these lines. So we're here to propose a framework that was created and articulated by Andy Smith. Andrea Smith is a Cherokee academic and activist. She is brilliant. She has her PhD, her JD, and her MDiv. What am I doing with my life? She teaches at UC Riverside. And what's really exciting about her is that she is always coming up with these really helpful ways to think about violence against women, about violence against women of color, about race and racism and patriarchy. So she's awesome. Read her if you can. This particular, she articulated, it's called Heteropatriarchy and the Three Pillars of White Supremacy, Rethinking Women of Color Organizing in the Color of Violence, the Insight Anthology. You can also maybe find online. So we're going to talk about those three pillars and see if they make sense for peace work and for us here. And then we can use those as our framework. So Jessica will start us off.
Yeah, so I wanna, remember, no microphone. So I'm gonna talk about both the pillar of slavery and the pillar of genocide. And what I wanna say about this is that the way that she frames this way of thinking about white supremacy is that Andy isn't interested in the KKK as the embodiment of white supremacy. She thinks that that isn't thinking deeply enough about what white supremacy actually is. She wants us to think about white supremacy as a system of meaning making, a way of making sense of the world. And so she accompanies each pillar with a logic. Each pillar has a logic that makes it powerful, that makes it enduring over time. And she fundamentally believes these three pillars are still operating in the United States today. These are not pillars of the past. These are the pillars of our current reality. And so the first pillar is the pillar of genocide. The logic of that pillar is colonialism. Now, how many of you feel like you have a really good grasp on colonialism? Right? You've been working stuff around, Israel, Palestine, stuff around the way in which that would be a perfect example of what classic colonialism is about. So I want to cite the word of my boss, Karuk, Indian woman from California named Robert Diaz, who's the executive director of Crossroads. And she identifies 4 basic characteristics of colonialism, 4 conditions that are necessary. Because Andy, in this pillar, is very specifically thinking about settler colonialism. That's the colonialism that gets this whole machinery started. And I want to reference, as a way of talking about these conditions, a papal bull from 1452 called Dum Diversas. Anybody familiar with the doctrine of discovery? Good, right? So go out and claim things in the name of God, right? You godly people. Well, this is what gets it started by Nicholas V, Pope Nicholas V. And 2 key pieces of that papal bull are the following. That, this was to the King of Portugal at the time, you are to go and reduce any Saracens, i.e. Muslims, and pagans to perpetual servitude. That's the first piece of this papal bull. The second piece, you are to capture, vanquish, subdue the Saracens, i.e. the Muslims, pagans and other enemies of Christ. That is what unleashes the discovery of the Americas, the colonizing of the continent of Africa. It is that building block that is all over American Christianity. It's the seed from which it comes. So that when we're talking about the pillar of genocide and the logic of colonialism in the context of us, the US, and the church that we are a part of, the Presbyterian Church USA, for many of us, we are talking about a colonialism that was built on violent invasion of other people's land by military force. We are talking about a way of settling a land that was never ours to begin with and committing genocide in the process to do it. We are talking about the imposition of ways of life, of economic ways of life, of cultural ways of life, of government upon people while dismissing their ways of life as being uncivilized and pagan and inadequate. We're talking about culture used as a weapon, the imposition of a foreign way of life upon people, and then calling their way of life inferior to the way of life of the settler. And then we're talking about all of this being done and justified by the supremacy of the settler. Supremacy built on the notion that God granted it to them. They're not just superior, God made them superior. Now, what we also know about colonialism is that colonialism in this way is costly, way too costly for the settler nation. So that then this pillar over time transforms into what we would call neo-colonialism. You're familiar with that term? Right? I always say banana republics, and people immediately know what I'm talking about, right? It's the kind of corporatization of colonialism. So that we have them 5 conditions. You don't need military invasion. You just need to prop up governments that will ensure that the settler nation's economy is what matters and their interests. It's corporate bodies and global corporations collaborating with colonial nations in order to ensure their interests are met, right? Is military used to protect the interest of the corporations and not people, right? Is extracting natural resources, human and of the land, not for the people there, but for the people away, and then making the people in the nation being colonized, if you will, have to pay 3 and 4 and 5 times the cost of the very resource that they grew, right? It's taking the bananas out of Ecuador, bringing them to the US, and having the people there have to pay for bananas from another nation, for example. And what makes it work is the same ideological notion that some people are better, more superior than other people. So for Andy Smith, this notion of genocide is not genocide of just the indigenous people. It's a perpetual state of genocidal activity that kills people and culture and ways of life. And that at this point is completely embedded into how we do and be in the world. Now that sets up the second pillar, which is the pillar of slavery. Now, the slavery pillar is held up by capitalism. Now, why would we say that capitalism is the logic of slavery? What do you think? Say what? You can make the most money? Commodifies life? Right? We would say at Crossroads that capitalism commodifies life and the natural world. Right? That it is about the extraction of wealth from human bodies. So that then slavery isn't just about the enslavement of African peoples or the enslavement, and in the case of the US, and we invented this, by the way, we invented chattel slavery. It wasn't just that we were enslaving people, it's that we were generationally enslaving people, and that we equated them with property and removed all humanity from them. So there's that kind of enslavement, all the way to the enslavement that is perpetuated by our corporations today, so that we can have cheap products, so that we can have iPhones and Mac computers that we can afford by slave labor in other nations, right? So you see the tie between neocolonialism and colonialism and the tie between slavery and genocide, right? And we don't have to, we're not actively participating, right? Actively participating in any of this, and yet we are completely wrapped up into it because of its ideological systemic manifestations. Oh, yes, thank you. She keeps me honest. The other thing that I would say, and I wrote my own note there, which is why she's reminding me of it, is that when I think about slavery in the US today, it's impossible for us not to talk about the prison industrial complex as a system of enslavement. That when folks are in a prison in this nation, they aren't just sitting there, they're actually being hired out to private corporations to do work for them at 10 and 12 cents an hour, right? Those prisoners have to pay for their being there, right? And I think about also things like the reemergence of debtors' prisons, right? This notion of if you can't pay, then you go to prison. And we're gonna charge you for every day that you're in prison, even though that you're in prison and you cannot work to pay for the thing that you owe that got you in prison to begin with. So that you create these systems of commodified labor and commodified life, all to extract resource and money and wealth for those who are dominant in the society. Now the last pillar.
The last pillar is perpetual foreignness, and the logic for perpetual foreignness is war. So when we talk about perpetual foreignness, we're talking about the people who don't melt into the melting pot. Right? So people, even if they've been there for generations and their 4th generation, still get asked where they're from. And this, we who don't melt very well, get conflated with outside nations that we're always needing to surveil and invade. So that would be why Islamophobia is so huge, and anyone who may or may not be Muslim and may or may not be Arab, which means a lot of Sikhs get hit by this, are considered to be perpetual foreigners. Who were they really loyal to? And this is also why a lot of Chinese and Chinese Americans are often the ones who get caught spying on behalf of the Chinese government, even though they're not actually spying for the Chinese government. They were just visiting family and they happen to work for a technology corporation. So that's what we mean by the perpetual foreigner. We're also talking about those people who, were in this country before it was this country. So we will be talking about the part of Mexico that we took in 1848. These are also people who are considered perpetual foreigners. And we're always so worried about what's coming across that southern border, right? And we spent all this money to build a wall that's now pushing a lot of migrants into very dangerous deserts. And oddly enough, there's another wall that's up in Palestine that was funded by many and built by many of the same companies, same monies. So that sense of we have these people inside our country that we need to watch, and we are going to use that same logic, and it extends into which countries we decide we're going to invade because they can't be trusted. They have resources that we may or may not want, but really it's about defending our freedoms because they don't think the same way we do. They don't care about their children in the same way. They don't care about their own lives, and that's why they would all be terrorists. So you can see the logic of that third pillar. So there are a couple of court cases that might be helpful, and I'm actually going to ask Jessica to explain them to you because she's memorized them a lot better than I have. I'm pronouncing this. Thank you. They're Asians, but she knows it better.
I really don't do that.
Sorry.
So part of the way that this last pillar works, right, is that, and particularly how it works in the U.S., that in the U.S. we're a nation of laws, right? And so what we did in the U.S., and we scoffed at that, yeah, but we are a nation of law. The law matters a lot here. And the law was a primary instrument for the codification of racial bias in this nation. These little identities that we have aren't just, sociological constructs that we can get to opt out of. They're legally constructed. Until 1952, unless Congress acted, the only person who could be a citizen, the only group that could be legally a citizen of this nation were white people. Every other group required an act of Congress to make that happen. Till 1952. Is when we stop using race as a category for citizenship. So how many people were born prior to 1952 in this room? So in your lifetime is when race ceased to be a category for citizenship. And so what happens is that all along that, beginning in the late 1800s, the great migrations from Europe, all the way to the 1930s and 40s, people were going to the Supreme Court to say, I want to be a citizen. I want to apply for citizenship. And so there's two significant court cases that help create that notion of, or codify that notion of people who will never melt, particularly for Asian Americans in the US. One of them is this guy named Takao Ozawa. Takao Ozawa was a Japanese man who wanted desperately to be a citizen of the US. And he petitioned the court in 1922 to become a citizen. And he was a Christian, he spoke English, he went to UC Berkeley, he distanced himself from everything that was Japanese. He lived among white people, he didn't let his children have any relationships with the Japanese community. And his case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court says to him, well, while we appreciate all of your heroic efforts, and by the way, the argument that he made was that while it was true that he was technically not white, meaning Caucasian, that was the language at the time, he says, in character, I am American. And isn't that what American is? Isn't American about the content of our character? So he makes this argument all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, thank you, Mr. Ozawa, yeah, not so much. What we mean by citizen and white in the US is we mean a person of Caucasian ancestry. You are a Mongoloid. Therefore, you do not get to be a citizen. Now here's what's interesting. 6 months later, the case of Bhagat Singh Thind came up in the court. Bhagat Singh Thind was a Sikh man. He was, in fact, from a part of India that runs through the Caucasus Mountains. Biologically, he is Caucasian. So the court now, 6 months later, received this case of this man who is technically Caucasian and therefore eligible for citizenship. And the court, the exact same court, said, well, you know, that we said 6 months ago, yeah, never mind. What we actually meant is that it is the understanding of the common man that makes one a citizen. And you, Mr. Singh Thind, you are not a common man. Now, when we think about the power of that, right, the notion of what it means to be normative, common, normal, average, that in the US, that is about whiteness. And that pillar didn't stop in 1922 and in 1923, and it hasn't stopped to this day. These pillars are pretty much a part and are undergirding every conversation we have about race in the US. So what Andy says is that you can't understand race and racism in the US if you don't understand white supremacy. That the question, the thing that we have to struggle against is white supremacy. That is our enemy. That's where dehumanization happens. So in your handouts, we put a definition of racism that I think then is informed by this notion of what racism is in the context of a white supremacist nation. We are not, you know, we tend to think of racism. If I were to say to you, what is racism? What is most often the things that we say? We'll say structural privilege, discrimination, prejudice towards power. But we don't say, well, it's white supremacy. Because who are the white supremacists? And talking about that distancing language, those mechanisms of distancing, then we create this distance by identifying who as white supremacists in our society. Who are they? The KKK, the crazy people, the bigots, the Tea Party, right? That's the skinheads. We're good Christian people. We're not white supremacists. Those people are white supremacists, right? And so there's all these linguistic mechanisms that we have to separate ourselves from a language that makes us cringe, that just makes us cringe inside. And so Andy Smith and a professor, Paul Shee, that we're gonna cite in a little bit, both say, we have got to be prepared to deal with the question of white supremacy and what white supremacy is. So I want you to, you're gonna have a chance to look at these definitions in your small groups, but the thing that I wanna point out to is in the middle of this definition, that says that racism is a system of meaning that rests upon the fears and anxieties of white Americans and is expressed in the cultural symbols, social order, and public policies of the country. It is a system of meaning. That's why it's so hard to get rid of. Racism helps make meaning out of our social order. That's why the pillars allow us to begin to break apart what racism is actually doing for us. And the other thing is that I like to think of racism as a matrix, right? What is a matrix? Other than a movie. What is a matrix? Multidimensional?
Yeah, vertical and horizontal.
Vertical and horizontal? Intersecting, right? There is this matrix in which racism operates that actually helps make meaning in every sense. Racism is completely logical in a totally dehumanizing way. And Christianity helped make the logic happen, right? Who are created in the image of God, according to the lore of the US. Who's created in the image of God?
Yes.
White men. Who own land? Right? I think about that, you know that speech, City on a Hill? That sermon from John Winthrop,
Yes.
that the U.S. is a city on a hill, right? The New Jerusalem, right? Think about how we positioned ourselves in the world. We are a city on a hill. We are the New Jerusalem. We are the new people with whom God has made a pact in the world. We are the manifestation of God. Was that the Native people who were part of that we? Black people part of that we? Asian American part of that we? No. So if we're gonna deal with the conversation of racism, then we have to deal with a system of meaning making. And it is out of that understanding that then we have to then make sense of things like whiteness, white privilege, and white supremacy. So Laura's gonna chat a little bit about those three terms.
We people of color have spent a lot of time learning about whiteness, as you might imagine. So Brian, thanks, you got it. Brian Vasquez has a good, a helpful definition of whiteness. So you can think about it in three ways. It's a location of structural advantage. So we're going to talk a little bit about white privilege. It's also a standpoint, the place from which white people see themselves and others. And third, it's a set of cultural practices that we don't usually name as like the white culture. Right? So he has that. We are actually going to hear from a white man, because that seems responsible actually. His name is Alan Johnson, and he's the author of one of the books that we listed, and we brought it into the room, and now I don't remember where it is. I think it's in Jessica's purse. But we'll be listening to him talk about whiteness, provided it does show up for us.
This is about 6 minutes, and he's gonna be outlining what he wrote a book called Privilege, Power, and Difference, and he's gonna outline it in this talk. It's a 20-minute talk, out of which we're going to see 6 minutes, where he outlines what he calls the markers of white privilege.
So you can listen and see how much of this makes sense to you.
Race, if you hear this framework, you can apply it across the board to most forms of privilege. The system of white privilege is state or participating has four basic characteristics. The first is that it's white dominated, which is one of the simplest actually, because all it means is that in any social system that has an unequal distribution of power, as you look upwards in the hierarchy, you will tend to see white people. That will be the default. And if you see someone who's of color, you'll notice them. That's an exception. As you look downward in the hierarchy, you'll tend to see people of color. That's all that it takes for a system to be white dominated. Notice that this does not mean that all white people are powerful. Most white people are not powerful in this society. It also does not mean that people of color never had power. Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell had a lot more power than everyone. That has nothing to do with the white dominated character of society. So that's white dominance. Second characteristic is that systems of privilege are organized around an obsession with control. Control is enormously important in systems of privilege because they are unnatural. They are imposed. And each generation has to be socialized, coerced, into accepting that system and accepting their place in it. So for kids, for example, this may show up when white kids start discovering that it's not okay that they have friends who are kids of color. And this gets communicated to them in a variety of ways. You know, you have birthday parties, and all of a sudden, all the white kids are getting invited to your birthday party. You speak all the time, of course, that color that discover on what's going on. This is not something they like. So they have to be somehow coerced into accepting this as a normal state of affairs. It's correct. It's appropriate. That takes control. It also requires control to keep solidarity within the dominant group. Stand for white people. White people, in order to exercise their privilege, have to be able to assume that when they congregate with other white people, that they're safe on the subject of race. That everyone shares the basic support of white privilege. And you find this out. If someone steps off the path of racial resistance and objects to a racist joke, for example, when we were white people, somebody tells a racist joke, one white person says, I don't like that. They step off the path of racial resistance. In all the ways that they can get punished for doing that. Well, one of the things that does is that when the white people witness this, the next time they're with white people, they can't be quite so sure of solidarity just because they're being white. So there's a lot of control and coercion that has to operate within the dominant group as well as between the dominant group and the subordinate. So that's the obsession with control. Fairly straightforward. The third characteristic is a little messier, and that is that the system of white privilege is white identified. In the simplest sense, white identification means that white people and their experience are taken as the standard for human beings in general. So to be human in a white identified society is synonymous with being white. You can see this in the language. People of color are often referred to as non-white. In other words, white is the standard, and they are simply not the standard. Compare that with, imagine you live in a society in which white people were referred to as non-colored. That would be universal identification, or colorless. We live in a society in which non-white is routinely used because white is the standard. This means then that the way that white people walk and talk and dress and wear their hair becomes defined as what's normal for a human being, and everything else becomes marked as other, as something different that is not the norm. This is a routine practice of marking of people in subordinate groups. It's also true for women, for example. Being marked as the other, as the outsider. If there was a group of people who gathered outside the White House to protest something, and they were all white, the New York Times would not point out to a group of white people organized outside the White House. They would just say a group of people. But if a group of people of color gathered outside the White House, you can be sure that the New York Times would not only mention that fact, but they would then try to find out why. Race now would become an issue, because people of color in white identified society are marked as color. I was once doing a training at Harvard in the campus police department, and discovered one of the consequences of this white identification, which is that white people have no real reason to be aware of themselves as white. Our race becomes invisible to us. The great author James Baldwin put it as being white means not having to think about it. And we were doing this training at the campus police department at Harvard. And at Harvard, the campus cops wear guns. Okay, they're real cops. And we were doing a session on race, and a white officer was trying to be sensitive. He turned to an African American officer and said, "So tell me, tell me what's it like being black?" We got the ball about it. He said, "Well, I'll give you an example." He says, "If I'm out of uniform and it's nighttime and I'm walking through the Park Square by myself, and the campus police department is by, I feel a little nervous." Now, these are his colleagues. But his nervousness is they may not see that. They may just be black. I think they may not do something. Then he shocked everyone. He turned to the white guy and he said, "So tell me, what's it like being white?" And there was this really long silence. The man had no idea what to say about what's like being white. He could have said, "Well, if I was in that position, I would have turned and I would have waved." That would have been a perfectly acceptable interview. That's what it's like being white. He didn't have any reason to be afraid in that situation. That's part of what it's like.
Just kidding.
So he writes that privilege, we've talked about white supremacy and white privilege, they are not the same. So we're going to shift a little bit to privilege. He says, privilege is something that society gives me. Oh, sorry, there is a fourth characteristic that he doesn't get to because it takes a long time. And it's a white-centered world. That's what he talks about. So if you actually go back and find that, we can tell you, I think we put in the link maybe for that so that you can look at that in full. He talks about how privilege is something society gives me, and unless I change the institutions that give it to me, they will continue to give it. And I will continue to have it, however noble and egalitarian my intentions. I think this is something that's a little bit hard for a lot of us who are accustomed to having a lot of our own agency. You know, I'm highly educated, I have a particular class status. Both my parents always told me I could do whatever I wanted to do. My dad's always been super supportive. And so I always think like, oh, then I have the power to take things on or to give things up. And it turns out that when we live in these systems, that's not something we can do voluntarily. You can't just strip off a piece of your privilege and hand it to me, nor do I necessarily want it, which is something we can talk about. David Shee, who we put his blog post in your handout so you can get to it. He was thinking about how much currency white privilege has now as a buzzword. Some of us know that that's been around in the academy for 30 odd years, right? But now, since Jon Stewart and Bill O'Reilly are talking about it, it's now everyone knows about it apparently, whether or not they believe that it exists. And he thought, this is interesting that we've made this shift, that now people are very comfortable talking about it, particularly good liberals. And he says it's conceptualized as a thing that white people have, that they possess, and that people of color do not have. And he then makes a really helpful distinction between white privilege and white supremacy. He says white privilege is nothing more than applied white supremacy for white people. So I always think when we are talking about white privilege, honestly, it's important work and y'all should do that. But that's not really the root of the problem. And oftentimes we talk about it being the root of the problem. The root of the problem is white supremacy in those 3 pillars that we talked about. And white privilege is just a fortunate manifestation for some of us. He says, because it is unthreatening, the possessive dimension of white privilege is the reason why it is a popular way for white allies to talk to other white people about racism. So you might say something like this: we have something that people of color do not. Let's work harder so they can have these things too. Which is somewhat similar to how a lot of straight allies would talk about the gay marriage rights, that, oh, we have these rights, why don't we, and he makes this parallel in his article, why don't we make sure that gay people have the same rights, instead of thinking, maybe we should take away some things because we might have institutionalized a few unhealthy dynamics. But we could talk about that later too.
It's a pretty long list.
You know, there's a lot of things we're going to talk about. White privilege allows white allies to bypass the prospect of being psychologically damaged, of having internalized superiority, of being unable to reach their full potential. So when we talked about a little bit earlier about the self-interest, really, for all of us to do this work, it's not because we just want to be good to other people and make sure that they have what we have, which honestly can be a very first world impulse as well. We want everyone to have what we have. But maybe it's more thinking about how are all the ways that I am being dehumanized every day because I live with this system of benefits that hurts other people. How have I been stunted emotionally or culturally or as a human because we live in this system that takes relationship away from us, whether or not we actually want it. So now we're going to talk about anti-racism. So when we think about peace work, it's such a big category, right? But in some ways we think anti-racism is how you do peace building. There are so many ways in which the divisions of white supremacy have stripped us of the capacity to have really healthy relationships with people who are different from ourselves. And you could argue have really unhealthy relationships with the land based on how we tend to live out that pillar of genocide. So a colleague of Jessica's has this really helpful blog that we actually printed out for you. And that's the article that you have, James Addington. And he says, anti-racism is the practice of strategic interventions in the processes of racialism that repair and restore community. So anti-racism is an active orientation. It's not just something that you think you want to be, I want to be anti-racist, but it's a way that you are attempting to participate in dismantling the systems of white supremacy. It is a counter logic to white supremacy. So with those 3 pillars of white supremacy, each having a logic, anti-racism also has its own logic of trying to repair relationships through the destruction of these systems and making something else possible. And so we've seen in the recession, and some of us have also lived through depressions as well, that what happens is we see a lot of nativism, right? People say we need to protect our jobs from those brown people, usually brown people south of the border, or in India now, everyone loves to hate the Indian customer service representatives, even though those customer service representatives, their labor is being exploited. Then we, as anti-racist people, if we claim that, can be that counter logic. We can help live into that counter logic. And it's not just about getting along, although that can be really nice to get along with each other. It's about communal work of discovering what are the lies all of us have been told as systems, as laws, as cultures, as relationships, And what are the structures that undergird those lies, and how do we create something new? So we are going to ask you to break up into small groups, and we thought it'd take about 15 minutes, and you can even just talk to people near you. Sorry. Into groups of 4, because beyond that, you won't all have a chance to talk, honestly. And if you could talk about what's something that grabbed you that was a little bit different than you had heard before. So I know a lot of us have done a lot of work on this. So what's something that maybe was a little bit new, or that you found kind of interesting, you hadn't thought about that before, or that you were reacting to? So if you can take some time, break up into groups, and then we'll call you back together in 15 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, that's later. Right now, let's do groups of 4.
Yes, you can mix up anyway. It doesn't have to be PPF, which is 30.7. However you want to do it.
Sure.
Yeah.
So this is, I just want to make sure I know where we are.
You're right here.
Okay. And then you're going to come back and let
Yeah,
them
we're gonna
process.
let do 15,
And
and
then
then we're gonna set up.
I'm going to set
You'll
up
set up the
small
next thing.
groups,
Yeah.
and then come back to the gallery.
Yeah, yeah.
So right now I'm going to go get some more easels.
Awesome.
So that we have this back.
Go. Okay. Look. It's like, I mean, have this three degrees. Well, the frustration is that you're entertaining.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that like in any aspect there are the other. Well, so the thing is, so part of the three things. One of it is that you want a regulatory they can't do any of the weird things. You can't do grants the way you do grants. You can't do your job. So they need to for correction. I understand, and you're right about based on how men in science, have gone research, so that even though it's easier to be frustrated over correction, I suppose they never actually where the overcorrection is trying to drive this. I think the other thing is that there are people who get set up on this because they don't, regardless of their credentials, and while we find I make home But when it comes to somebody that is so glad to see that, then I show you like the external characteristics. That's also that is usually been around like this. It becomes a problem when we I think that the place where we have no imagination, and I know not yet, the place where we don't have imagination, that we're looking for solutions after such. We're looking for solutions. It's in a human system. Everybody's gonna have to be every single one. Me, you, Laura. We're talking about organizing inside and that's what's hard. Like, that's what's hard.
Oh God, no.
Happens all the time. By acknowledging one of the steps is acknowledging the biases. Acknowledging what is created actually. Because those people of color that get good jobs, those women that are underqualified are used by their institution for their business, right? And when they fail, they'll provide the evidence. Because of their weight. Well, because otherwise you have an open. How would it's not the right but those people are behind the man. Yeah. Oh yeah. That's a fun thing.
Yeah, so it's been 12 minutes. Awesome.
Well, yeah, by the way, Oh, they're taking care of her.
Torres. Thank you for sharing.
No, we're at 50.
Thank you, everyone.
Come on back.
We're gonna come back.
Okay, let's go back. Oh, I'll take that from you. Ah, okay. Ah, okay.
Yeah, what is it? What is it?
So we do not actually want a full report back of all the things you said to each other, but just are wondering if there are any insights in particular that struck you, any questions you might have that we did not fully answer in our brief time of setting up incredibly complex theoretical frameworks, stuff like that. And we have a mic to pass around too.
You don't plug your hands in. We have a couple of hands. We'll go to the next.
I just had a question when you talked about not wanting what they have in terms of gay marriage, how the solution isn't the other group getting what the privileged people have. I just was wanting clarification.
Yeah, I think when we have certain privileges, they're so awesome, like air conditioning. Like we really want people to have that access because it's really been great for us and it works for us. So the funny thing about this is that just because it works for me doesn't mean it works for someone else in a different situation. So the way that marriage works, and I think that's kind of the easiest for me, the way that, well, I'm going to tell you all about marriage. So the way that the conversation, the way that the conversation has functioned in the U.S. around marriage rights in particular is that it falls along a very normative framework. So two individuals who decide that they love each other and want to share finances because honestly, that's what marriage is about in the U.S. It's not what we think of, but that's what the rights are. It's having economic access and having legal access and tax benefits. Oh my gosh, filing jointly. You guys, it's amazing. It's incredible. So what happened in the oh, it's because we live in a state that outlawed it, so we still have to do double. Anyway, okay, it's not that great. So rental cars, yeah, spouses can be on them for free. So you think about all these little economic things, right, that add up. But in the gay community, the conversation was, why are we working for marriage rights when that is basically a thing for middle to upper middle class, mostly kind of homonormative men, cisgendered, people who look like they present as the same gender that they mark on their forms, and it doesn't protect other forms of family, so like two siblings raising a child together. How do they get the same protections that a married couple would get?
Because that is what went away.
Yeah, because that actually did go away, which was a problem because now you have to be married to get domestic partner benefits. We had to go get married. We didn't want to get married. I mean, I'm glad now. So that's some of it is not questioning what's the overall framework. What's the overall framework that provides access and prevents access? Instead of attacking that framework, you just try to expand the framework to include more people.
Well, and I guess what I would add is that we never question the underlying ideology of why we have it, right? The assumption is that this is a thing that just works. And we never question, and I'm clear, I'm happy that I get to get married, okay? I've been married to this person 3 different times in 10 years. We just keep doing it. But so it isn't that I'm not grateful for all of the work that went into making that happen, and that I am not grateful for the changing of laws in the US to actually include people into rights. But the challenge that I think why marriage is such a good example is that we never question the underlying premise of whether or not marriage should be the work of the state or the work of the church in combination, right? We never question the underlying premises. The mindset of the privilege is, if the problem is diagnosed as a lack of access, the solution becomes, well, let's fight for access. We never go, the problem is we have structured human relationships in our society in a legal way that maybe it's problematic. Let's wonder about that.
So one of the things that Peggy McIntosh talked about in her initial essay about the things, it's a very possessive essay about the white privilege things that you have in your bag.
Seminal essay,
apparently.
yeah.
Yes. So it is really important to read, honestly, to get a good grasp of what the white privilege conversation is about. But one of the things is I don't get followed when I'm in a store. So is the point to make sure no one gets followed in a store, or is the point to destroy consumer capitalism so that we don't have to go pay for things and have to have the money to pay for things in the first place? Okay.
So I think
Now you're meddling.
So I think that's what we mean by, so I think that's the piece about the example around marriage, right? Is that we diagnose the wrong problem and solve the wrong problem. So that in the question of race, we diagnose racism to be racial prejudice, or we diagnose racism to be people don't have access to housing. That's an important thing to diagnose. So, but we throw all of our energy at fixing personal privilege or seeking access to housing. Wonderful things to work on. Neither one of those things ended racism. They fixed a problem of access caused by racism. They didn't actually fix racism, right?
Talk about marriage privilege.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, well, yeah, that's a whole other conversation. So there's a hand over here that, there's a mic too, somewhere around.
We talked about white privilege systemically, and the military-industrial complex being the flip side of the coin of the prison-industrial complex, and following the money. And also looking for clarification, what is the overlap or the simultaneity of white Christian Judeo privilege as opposed to white privilege, and the male as well? And if we look at the prison industrial complex and the military industrial complex, which is killing people all over the world, it is a group of a few men, probably.
Yeah, I would say a group of a few men supported by the rest of us, right? Because
You're
it's
welcome,
like,
guys.
yeah, like it's. I think that my first initial reaction is to say it's really easy to scapegoat what gets done in our name, and to the extent that we all pay taxes, and that our taxes go to pay for those stuff, it's what we do collectively. Those men are just doing what we're telling them to do. But I think the link between the Judah and the men and women, because it's not just men. I think that the link between Judeo-Christian stuff and whiteness, it's one worth naming, particularly for the PCUSA these days. So I'll let you start that.
Well, we talk a little bit, not this time, but about intersectionality, or what's the other term that Drew uses?
Simultaneity? How about intersectionality?
That there are all of these layers, right? So it's not just that you're a dude. You got to be a certain kind of dude. You have to be a cisgendered male, white, Judeo-Christian, but waspy, right? You should definitely probably not be Catholic. And you should be from a particular part of Europe and heterosexual. So you talk about all of these layers of identity that nuance the ways that we all experience privilege. So, of course, when we talk about whiteness as the norm, we're talking also that there is this other norm called Judeo-Christian, and oftentimes what we're really talking about is the WASP normativity. It's a certain kind of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, because until very recently, the whole thought of a Catholic president super freaked people out. That was not that long ago, right? And the Jewish president thing is going to take a bit. So to think about all of these nuances is really important. Also because the way that we have racialized Christianity and the way that we have racialized other religions is particularly problematic within the United States. When we think Islam, we think Arab, which is totally inaccurate when you look at global Islam, right? Or in Indonesia, So there are all of these things that we in the US racialize incorrectly and inappropriately.
I also would say, because I think this is pertinent. I also think that then it affects how we do our foreign policy. It affects how we think about what we advocate for and not for in the U.S. So when I think about it, I am so gonna meddle right now. When I think about all of my fellow Presbyterians, because I'm one Presbyterian. When I think of all of my fellow Presbyterians that are pro-Israel, and I look at that group racially, what I see are upper middle class white people who are identifying with upper middle class white people in the US, who happen to be Jews. And we don't ever talk about that in the questions about Israel-Palestine. That we don't talk about the impact of race and how we have racialized the Jewish community in the US as being a white community, and the Muslim community as being that other perpetual foreigner community. And so that as an undergrounded root to a lot of our conversations never gets named. But you can't, and this framework operates, if white supremacy is what's underneath, then it makes total sense that we tend to have the conversations we have about the conflict in Israel-Palestine and how we have shaped our foreign policy around it. It's a conflict between white people and others. And we've claimed our allegiance to the white people.
What's coming to mind for me is how medicine has really been created around white supremacy.
Oh, yes.
I mean, until maybe recently, all research was based on the white person. And so we have a medical system that was designed not for people of color, not for people of other ethnicities, but pharmaceuticals were tested on white people. So, trying to keep us a world healthy cannot just be done based on the white male. So.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, what is that book, the Henrietta Lacks? Because the medicines were also developed with white people in mind. And so when I think about the Tuskegee experiments and the testing of the new developed medicine to fix white bodies, those medicines were tested on the bodies of people of color. Like, so the sterilization experiments of Puerto Rican women by pharmaceutical companies trying to develop reproductive prevention for women in the US. Well, the story of Henrietta Lacks to me is just the ultimate story of that. You want to say a little bit quickly about that?
You should read this book by this woman whose title, I can't remember the title, but if you look at Henrietta Lacks, sorry.
Yeah, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. Yes.
So
we'll write it up.
Cancerous tissues were taken without her knowledge or her family's consent. And they are these cells that never stop growing and no one can figure out why. So it's been used by generations at this point of scientists to develop so many things that we use now. A lot of cancer drugs, just all the things. And her family didn't know about it until a few years ago. And they just won a lawsuit that actually now gives them some rights to some of the proceeds. But basically, these are people who never made it, like they're not upper middle class now because their great-grandmother's cells were used. They were never compensated for any of this. And to just think about that as one part of our story, about how the bodies of people of color are used to further medical research on behalf of white bodies, that's just one piece of it.
Can I just add a racial comment on that? Because when I was doing my graduate work, I actually used HeLa cells. And we all knew that HeLa actually stood for a name, and we all knew that the name was actually Helen Lang.
Interesting what you knew.
Interesting what you knew.
Yep.
Wow. I just have to sit there for a minute with that. Holy crap. Other thoughts or questions?
Here.
Over here on the front.
Just letting you guys know, my background is I got educated in television media, and I thought that would be one of the further places, especially being Canadian, to notice an issue of racial prejudice. And I was very intrigued to find out when we were learning the fine details and dynamics of setting up cameras and doing lighting. We were taught about the history of film and television and how it took a while for them to invent a good camera to properly pick up the image and the portrait of a person of color, because when these cameras were initially developed, they only thought that they would be filming white Caucasian people, so therefore they engineered these cameras and this film and the entire setup of the camera to film a Caucasian person, and it was only after some pushing and time that they actually put in the time and effort to develop different types of cameras and filming devices to properly film and clearly pick up the image of a person of color.
Wow. We have time for one more question, and then we're going to transition.
I wonder if the song Pawn of the Game by Bob Dylan is a helpful resource to tie into your concept of white privilege and white supremacy.
Pawn of the Game?
Yes, you know the song.
I don't know that I know the song, but I am reminded by the title of the lecture that Dr. Johnson does, that we saw a snippet of, actually begins with him describing the game of Monopoly. And he talks about how, he's like, I don't play Monopoly anymore, because what Monopoly makes me is a participant in this awful arrangement. And he starts describing his behavior when you play Monopoly, right? And it resonated with me because we just willingly bought our niece the game Monopoly and spent 2 nights with her teaching her how to be greedy.
I was trying to teach math and negotiation skills.
I was clearly in it for the win, and I won. I just destroyed both of them. But what he says is that Monopoly, just like a society, is a social system, and they are these paths of least resistance in a social system, and that in that social system, in order to win Monopoly, you have to follow the path of least resistance, right? So you have to be willing to be a pawn of its game. If you resist the path that is actually set up, you will not win Monopoly. You will not win the game. And so I think that the piece to be thinking about as we transition and begin to think about organizational implications is that it's not the solution to what we are dealing with here isn't just bring more people of color. Because if you're going to bring more people of color and you're not actually going to listen to what they have to tell you, take their analysis into account, and change your ways of being in order to include or adapt to or be challenged by their analysis, then don't invite them, because they're going to leave. Because they'll understand fairly quickly that you just invited them so that you can be more colorful, right? And that model, the church has perfected it, and look at where it's got us, right? It's the first thing. The second thing is that this question of being a pawn of the game is that as we think about the organizational implications, we have to think about the game, the pawn, the game in which we're in, isn't just a game that is about the external reality of the US. That peace, the work of peacemaking, isn't just about nuclear armament and isn't just about settler territories, because we are the ultimate settler nation. We are the model for the settlements of other places. We are the model for Nazi Germany. We are the model for Israel. And so that all of that attention and energy that we put out there, we have to begin to ask the question, we are the neo-colonial nation by par excellence. So we have to figure out, in this game, how do we challenge all of the game that we are in? And then the third thing, as we transition and thinking about organizational implications, is what would have to be different. There's this guy named Otto Charmer, Otto Scharmer writes out of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, oddly enough, and he works on, he's a social psychologist, and he works on organizational development. And he says, you know, for an organization to find new life, at some point, it's gotta stop doing the things that are killing it. Because you can't keep doing the same thing you're doing and assume that it'll bring you different results. So at some point, you have to find an interruption. You gotta identify how are we being pawns in a game. You have to identify what role are we playing, and then you just gotta decide, I'm stopping some of the stuff. I'm ceasing to do it. Diana Butler-Bass has been writing about it. So that's the question for organizational implications also is, what might you have to be, how might you have to be different? What might have to be fundamentally interrupted for new life?
That was just enough time for us to figure out the technology.
There you go. Let's listen to our song.
First of all, we all appreciate the time that Jessica and Laura have put into all of this and all of what that represents in their lives of doing a lot of thinking about this with me, please. So this is our transition. I'm going to do what I never do, which is let you go to the bathroom. But you have to promise me in return that you will be back here in 10 minutes, no more, because we still have real work to do. So we're going to play the song, the Bob Dylan song that William suggests, as you go and do what you need to do, and then be back here in 10 minutes sharp, please. Go ahead.
Good. I think it's what's there. Oh yeah, make it big. You saw already. There it is.
Get out in the dark, then check this car, 2 eyes to me. Behind me, he's only a pawn in that game. I'm politician, pretend to the fool like me. Not more than Blackstone complain. You're better than mine.
Reverend Allen. Yeah.
The fact that you're guessing. There's also the Jewish life, which is the Jewish life.
Yeah.
It's a big yes, it's around it. Philosophy.
Well, yeah, but it's not my favorite.
But
That's programming.
some folks like.
So she does programming.
I'm gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. I'm gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside. Study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. So, trying to think about the best way to do this. There's an aha moment for me today in this conversation that Laura provided when she said something kind of really quick and just rolled right by it. She said, anti-racism is the counter logic to white supremacy, which I think I know at some level to be true, but I hadn't put in that simple language before. And I found it really kind of freeing. I kind of paused there and thought about that some. I like the word anti-racist, and I like adopting the word, the project of becoming an anti-racist community or organization for a variety of reasons. I also want to appreciate Laura and Jessica's intentionality about insisting that while the work of doing white privilege examination is critically important to any group that is overwhelmingly white, as is the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, it does not allow us to escape the language around white supremacy. That for me is new in the last 24 hours as I've been talking with them this trip, and I find it really helpful. So that leap from white privilege, which is work that we've been trying to focus on for some time in the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, to adopting the language of white supremacy, which is something I think we're all going to have to think about a little bit. And then from there to developing the counter logic, insisting that we will embrace the counter logic to white supremacy as an organization that is anti-racism. That's just an interesting trail that I'm going through in my own head, and I invite you into that mulling over with me this afternoon and in an ongoing way. Having said that, when Laura and Jessica and Kitty and I sat down to talk about what we're really hoping for here, one thing we were clear about is that we've been having in the Peace Fellowship an active conversation about race and racism and power and privilege that's now gone on for about 4 years. And that conversation has largely been framed by conversations that we've lifted up here in the context of our convocations. In fact, Jessica came, I think, for the first convocation we did to help us begin that conversation. And it's notable to me how different this conversation is from the one that we had 4 years ago with Jessica. So I want to appreciate that while it may feel like we are still wrestling with largely the same questions, in fact, the very fundamentals of our conversation have changed, and we are not any longer talking about whether or not racism is a reality or whether or not white privilege is a reality. We've come a long way in our conversation. So my goal for this afternoon in the last hour is that we can actually now do some really critical thinking and strategizing about where being an anti-racist organization would take us. What are the implications for each of the areas in which we work of being intentionally anti-racist? One last thing I want to say before I turn to how we'll do that is that I also really appreciate, and I referred to this obliquely as I introduced Laura and Jessica, the language of anti-racism, because it allows an intentionality in partnership between people of color and white people, right? It's a place where we can all clearly come together to say, we're gonna work together to create this anti-racist institution or organization, because all of us have got a role to play in that. Just as in one way or another, I've heard Jessica say often, people of color have played a real role in creating those structures or participating in one way or another in those structures of white supremacy as well, right? So this is a place where we can all kind of work together on the project. So having said all of that, Stony Point Center and the Community of Living Traditions is in a kind of ongoing, kind of bouncing along conversation about these matters. And I'm going to encourage you all to be a group that just gets together and talks about what's come up for you and where you think that might lead us as an organization around these conversations. What does it mean for us to be an anti-racist community as the community of living traditions at Stony Point Center? And then having said that, the rest of us, I would like to work together this afternoon to think about what it would look like, how it would impact our work if we were being really intentional about being anti-racist. And I've started by putting up some areas where I'd like us to consider that, but there may be others that I haven't listed here, and there's room for that. So my idea is that there would be small groups around the following questions, wherever there's energy. If there isn't energy on one of these, that's okay with me. But that we ask the question, around our Columbia accompaniment work, what would it look like if we were putting the question of being an anti-racist organization front and center? How would that change how we do our work in Columbia with our partners in Columbia, right? Regarding our work in the Middle East around Israel and Palestine, and now increasingly around responding to US military aggression in response to ISIS and other acts of violence in the Middle East, what would it look like if we asked the question first, how should we as an anti-racist organization respond to this situation? How would that transform the work that we're doing in the Middle East? Or another one, I referred a couple of days ago to one of my great disappointments over the last few years, which is that I don't feel we have yet effectively figured out a way to respond to gun violence in our country. We've worked at it. It's not for lack of trying. Honestly, organizationally, we've put resources into it. We've tried in a number of ways to go down different paths. It just hasn't quite come together. And I want to say, when I use the words gun violence, I put etc. here, because at this point, I don't think we can talk about gun violence without talking about mass incarceration, or without talking about Ferguson and Long Island and Baltimore and Black Lives Matter. I think it all gets mixed up. And so the question that I would put before some of us today might be, what would it look like if affirming anti-racism and being an anti-racist organization as a fundamental, how would we approach this set of questions next? What would we try next to do? And then finally, this one, for the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship as an organization, and thinking about our structures of organization and how power is understood in our organization, because there's power in every organization. What would it look like? How would we be different if we were thinking about being intentional about being an anti-racist organization? So those are the four that I would think of, but I imagine there are others, and I invite right now, nice catch, sorry. I invite right now any other suggestions about small group conversations, and my intention would be that we would give you half an hour to go off and ask this question and brainstorm on it together. We'll assign locations, and there's an easel in each location with a magic marker, and I'd invite you to write out some of your ideas or draw them or whatever it might look like, and then bring your easel back and we'll make a gallery and give folks a few minutes to just go and look at what's on those pieces of paper, and then finish with a brief kind of Q&A about it. Does that make sense? So are there any other topics for the PPF, or I suppose for the CLT, around which you'd like to have intentional conversation about this afternoon, or if I named them up? Yes, and then Fritz, I'll come to you. I've named so far a group that would look at the community of living traditions and Stony Point Center, and then 4 PPF groups. One on organization, structures, and power, one on Columbia work, one on Middle East work, and one on gun violence, etc., for lack of a better way to put it. So are you proposing, Sandy, that we do a group to talk about how we approach supporting COs? Is that, I'm just trying to find language to put it here. Is that, do you have energy to be a part of that group? Okay, if you're willing to help kind of spark it, that would be just fine. So I'm going to call that one PPF COs, with conscientious objectives. Say that again, Matt.
Oh, I was just thinking about it in terms of labeling them. That could be military industrial complex.
No, I think this one is specifically around conscientious objectors as a group of people and needing to support them, which is an historic work of the PPF. Fritz.
Yeah, our work at General Assembly.
General Assembly.
How do we,
That's a great idea.
racist organization in our work at General Assembly?
Okay. Any others? Yes, sir.
We had talked earlier about the 5 affirmations of peace, and I think that it would be really important to integrate anti-racist ideology in talking about those 5 affirmations, in the sense that as we are talking to presbyteries about the affirmations, I think one of the leitmotifs of it is violence and harm. And I think it would be really important to include anti-racism as a part of that, because we can't talk about being a peace denomination without talking about anti-racism.
I think it's a great idea. That's great. I'm going to close it there because I don't want tiny little groups, and say that if this process works, I think we might continue it. We might be thoughtful about this in other ways. Let me just get a quick show of hands. So think for a moment. I'll read these. Think for a moment about which ones you're interested in, so that we know if we've got a critical mass for each conversation today. Okay. So organization structures and power, Colombia, Middle East, gun violence, etc., supporting COs, General Assembly, and peace discernment affirmations are the group possibilities. So I'm just going to ask for a quick show of hands to see if there are 3 or more people for each group, starting with PPF, structures and power and organization. 1, 2, yeah, okay, we got it. Colombia. Are there some people who want to do Colombia? Yeah, we definitely got it. Middle East. Yep, we got it. Gun violence, etc. Yep, we got enough on that one. COs. 1, 2, 3, 4. Great, we got it. General Assembly. 1, 2. I might join you all there if it feels like you need Laura. Yeah, that's actually great. Laura could be there. And then peace discernment affirmations. 1, 2, 3, 4. Excellent. I think we've got enough to call each one a group, okay? So, do you have a preference on where you all meet? Okay. Yeah, so on the newsprint, please bring back something that represents your conversation. It doesn't have to be the full report of what everyone said. In fact, it probably shouldn't be. But just some brainstorming you're doing, some pictures, some drawings, whatever you want to do, written or whatever, to be a part of the gallery about your conversation. So seminar 1 is where you all are from Stony Brook Center. Seminar 2, which is down the ramp on the right, that's where the conversation about PPF structures and power will be. Columbia will be in conference room B, right there. The Middle East, let's leave right here in this room. So conference A. Let's do gun violence. Sorry? Outside. Okay, picnic tables. I will bring you a pad of paper to work with out there, okay? PPF COs, you want to be in the dining room? Okay, dining room. Alonso, where do you want to be? You want to be outside? Another group outside? You can all go somewhere else if you like. Okay, you don't have to stay where I'm signing you. And let's put the last General Assembly group also in the dining room. So there'll be 2 groups. The General Assembly group will be closer to the coffee maker. That's low. Okay, it is now 4:05. Please be back here in this room at 4:35. Because we're going to finish at 5.
If you want a dose of chocolate or sugar, there's some candy.
Pick up candy on the way out the door.
You grab me. Yeah.
Yeah, you can have that one. I'm going to use this one, so just take this out.
You got your computer?
Yo, hi, my friend. I'm going to work with the Colombia.
And it's a normal something that takes beginning and second to two
I think it's really a good thing that there's no racism.
That's what?
Dawn.
Are we starting?
No racism in ME.
No, that's not it. We're supposed to say, how would we address what we want to do? And so we were anti-racist.
Yes. Yes. How would it impact our work in the Middle East if we put anti-racism front and center?
I think we already do.
I don't know.
Should we?
Do you think that we put anti-racism front and center in our Middle East work?
Should we identify where we see racism needs to be addressed?
Like in the apartheid wall. See, most of
Apartheid wall, the apartheid wall.
it's the most racist system people Western in this country.
During that trip, I heard a word repeatedly by some of these supposed progressive Israelis. And I didn't push back against it. And that was a word that's a real code word for me, or not so much code actually, segregation. And I didn't, I took the posture of listening.
You mean they said like we have segregation and they
No, they said the peaceful Israel-Palestine situation will involve segregation. Oh yes, directly stated during our meetings. Segregation. Okay. Now, they may have meant physical as well as, other than the physical, is enough to develop cultural separation. So to me, if I had another opportunity to interact with those folks, my approach would be to try to point out how that experience in my life of that sort of society and in South Africa and other places like that just doesn't work. Now, ultimately, that's not a system that's sustainable, or it's not right to begin with. But it's not only is it not right, it's not sustainable.
How would we, if as an organization, how would we directly name racism in Israel, Palestine specifically?
Different license plates for
Different.
Jews and non-Jews in Israel.
Oh, yeah. I get the physical manifestation.
Okay.
I get that, but I mean, if, as an organization,
Okay.
if we just said Israelis are racist,
No, we can't say. I support Israel. How about that?
and,
Then we're not sort of
and if you
blaming
said, if
them.
I were to say why is our support racist?
Our, we want to support 10 million a day.
But
$80.
you know,
To
that's,
one
that's
side.
not necessarily racist, and it's, and our support is not necessarily one-sided. I mean, we provide a couple of $2 billion a year to the Palestinians and
I don't
500.
No, that's quite too high, quite a bit too high.
All right, we put some scales, we draw some scales, weighted down supporting Gaza.
I'm not saying it's equal.
Tiny little
You
bit.
know, it's significant.
But is separate and equal, I mean, we got rid of separate and equal, right?
Well, I don't think we did. Our schools in the city are.
I understand what you're trying to say.
But
I'm just
we're supposed to talk about what would our work look like,
Yes.
not what.
Yes, what would
What
our
would
work
our
look like?
work look like if we thought if we were doing anti-racist work
Right.
in Israel, Palestine? And I think our work would not look a lot different from what we're doing now because we're supporting the end to the apartheid situation. The end of apartheid. We support the end of apartheid. And that's the bulk of our work.
And in speaking of foreign aid, I mean,